Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third virtual town hall organized by the AODA Alliance and the Ontario Autism Coalition. I'm your host, Laura Kirby-McIntosh. I'm the parent of two adults on the autism spectrum. I'm a veteran high school teacher, 27 years in, and also president of the Ontario Autism Coalition. There are at least 1/3 students with disabilities in Ontario schools today. That's 1 out of every 6 students. Today, we'll discuss what parents of students with disabilities can do to prepare for the fast approaching reopening of schools as the COVID-19 pandemic continues. Get ready for lots of practical tips and recommendations. Now, even though we'll be talking about Ontario schools today, we hope this helps people across Canada. And even though we're focusing on giving tips to parents, we hope that school boards, teachers, principals, and our friends in the Ministry of Education are taking notes. David, why don't you introduce yourself next?
Hello to everyone. My name is David Lepofsky. I'm your other co-host. I am chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. I'm also a retired lawyer and a visiting professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School. Adding to that, I'm a member of the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Toronto District School Board, and I'm its past chair. I'm a member of the Ontario government appointed Kindergarten to Grade 12 Education Standards Development Committee that's advising on the development of new regulations to tear down the barriers facing students with disabilities in our schools.
Thanks, David. And today we're also joined by a very special guest, Robert Latanzio. Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Laura, and hello, everyone. I wish to begin by thanking the Ontario Autism Coalition and the AODA Alliance for organizing this very timely event in such a short turnaround. And thank you for inviting me to speak and be part of this. So my name is Robert Latanzio. I am a lawyer and the executive director of Arch Disability Law Center. Arch is a specialty legal clinic, primarily funded by Legal Aid Ontario. And we provide a range of legal services to persons with disabilities across Ontario on many areas of law, including education and human rights law. I wish to highlight that we provide free summary legal advice to students and their families across Ontario.
All right. Thanks for joining us today, Rob, and a huge thank you to Arch for arranging and providing for today's American Sign Language interpreters and for helping us try to get real-time captioning up and running. Huge apologies, guys. There's been some technical issues on that, and we're terribly sorry, but we will publish a full script of this later. I want to tell you a little bit quickly about the Ontario Autism Coalition and what we do. We are a grassroots political advocacy group dedicated to fighting for publicly funded, evidence-based services for autistic people and their families. David, why don't you take a second to remind our viewers about what the AODA Alliance does?
The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance is a nonpartisan volunteer coalition that advocates for accessibility for people with all kinds of disabilities in Ontario. We advocate for the effective implementation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act to honor the human rights and constitutional rights of people with disabilities, including in the education area. Laura?
All right, it's time for shameless plugs. On Twitter, you can follow all 3 of our organizations at Arch Disability, at AODA Alliance, and at ONT Autism. We encourage you to tweet about your thoughts about today's event using the hashtags accessibility and hashtag AuntEd. That's a hashtag for everything to do with education in Ontario. The OAC webpage will have show notes from our program, including links to all the resources that we will mention today. So you can go to our website, ontarioautismcoalition.com, to find them later. I also want to just give a quick shout out to our off-screen star, my husband, Bruce McIntosh. He's the founding president of the OAC, who's running all the tech behind the scenes to make sure that we're streaming to you. So, with schools about to reopen in just a few weeks, parents are filled with uncertainty about their kids. How's this going to work? Will it be safe for our kids to go to school? Are the schools ready to make this work? Teachers, principals, and education workers are all scrambling to be ready in time. For parents of students with disabilities, the anxiety is even more pronounced. We're dreading the possibility that our schools are not prepared to fully and safely include our students at school. And parents of students with disabilities have good reason to be concerned. Long before the pandemic, Ontario's education system had far too many disability barriers. Then came COVID-19. Ontario had to quickly close schools and switch to online learning. That created even more barriers. Many groups, including all of ours, called on the Ontario government to create a province-wide plan to ensure that the learning needs of students with disabilities were met during distance learning. The government did not do so. The Ontario government has announced no comprehensive plan to ensure that students with disabilities are fully and safely included in the return to school, or to ensure that any distance learning that continues this fall will be barrier-free. So, what can parents do in the face of all this uncertainty and chaos? Well, as always, we'll need to take things into our own hands. Let's talk about what we can do. Now, let me preface this by saying that we're going to offer you some ideas today, but we don't pretend to have all of the answers. We also can't give legal advice here, especially over a virtual town hall like this. But still, there is much that we can offer by way of practical suggestions. So let's get started. Now, first things first, it is extremely important to remember right now that school boards, teachers, principals, and all school staff are absolutely frantic at this moment. School boards have been trying to figure this out all summer, and they're dealing with constant changes and announcements from the Ontario government. When you call your child's school or school board, please be kind, be understanding of the stress that all education workers are experiencing right now. We are truly living in unprecedented times, and this isn't easy for any of us. I suppose the big question on the minds of many parents is whether they should send their child to school or keep them at home. And we can't give you a yes or no answer to that. That's a very personal decision. I know that many of you have been asked to make that decision already without perhaps having all of the information that you need. Please check with your local school board or your child's school to see what the process is should you change your mind. If you've made the decision to send your child to school, but then circumstances change, the ministry has stated that you may pull your child out later in the school year. However, switching from online learning to in-person learning may involve waiting until the next school term. So it's a good idea to find out now what the process is. As you prepare for the challenges ahead, there are some resources that we want to share with you. First, I want to direct you to the excellent resources that have been developed by our friends at Arch Disability Law. As a parent and as your child's first advocate, you'll want to be sure to check out their website at archdisabilitylaw.ca. But you really don't want to miss the videos that they've produced, which can be found at inclusiveeducation.ca/advocacy for inclusion. They have great videos about individual education plans or IEPs, identification, placement, and review committees or IPRCs, exclusions, inclusive education, and much more. We also want to recommend Justice for Children and Youth. Their legal rights wiki page provides information about the legal rights of children and youth in Ontario, including an excellent section on education rights. Lastly, the OAC has produced its own education resource guide, which you can find on our website at ontarioautismcoalition.com. Now, you may find this odd, but I was looking it over last night, and our guide is really not very autism specific at all. It contains information about the IPRC process, links to relevant Ministry of Education documents, an education acronym cheat sheet, which is priceless, and much more. We have a number of education related videos as well that you can find on our OAC YouTube page. And please take a second to subscribe. We hope that all of these resources will help you plan for success. But as we all know, things don't always go as planned. So I want to ask Rob, if my child's rights aren't being respected, should calling a lawyer be my first step?
Well, seeking legal information and free summary legal advice from a lawyer can be very helpful and important, including in those early stages. So I do think it's a good idea to get that advice early on to understand what the advocacy strategy will be and what the process will be that you'll be in. But as I say that, it's really important to keep in mind that parents don't always need to be represented by a lawyer. And there's a distinction there. So it's really, really important to maintain and build direct communication and relationships with the school. So it's certainly a balance in terms of how parents want to go ahead in terms of their advocacy efforts and strategies. So that communication directly with the school can take many different types of forms, and that communication could include communicating directly with the teacher, with the vice principal, and all the way up to the principal of the school. And then, of course, in some specific situations, additional advocacy efforts are needed to go up that ladder. So that could include going to the superintendent of schools, and then following that, superintendent of special education, and then, of course, the top of that, that ladder would be the director of education, and then the board trustees, and then, of course, the Ministry of Education. And you can find this chain of command in the OAC resource guide if you'd like to have that. There are other available options for advocacy, though, which needs to be kept in mind, depending on the issues and the matter. So legal advice as to the most effective route to take when escalating a matter is definitely strongly recommended.
All right, so it may not necessarily be our first step, but if we've tried all of those other steps that you just mentioned to resolve issues, if parents need legal advice, can they call Arch?
Yes, I strongly recommend calling us or any other legal resources that can provide education and human rights legal advice.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. Okay, let's rewind a little bit. On July 8th of this year, Ontario's Education Minister, Stephen Lecce, said in the Ontario Legislature that on the AODA Alliance's advice, he had directed all school boards to check in with parents of students with disabilities over the summer to ensure that they've got the tools they will need to succeed. We don't know that if that in fact has happened. In these final weeks of August, therefore, one thing parents need to do is to gather information together about their child to share with their school. Creating a student profile of your child's strengths and needs can be extremely helpful. We're providing a link in the show notes to a website with some excellent templates that you can use to do this. As a teacher, I can tell you that receiving a document like this before the school year starts is incredibly helpful and goes a long way also to building a positive relationship, excuse me, with your child's teacher. David, what other information should parents be pulling together now, and how should they share it with their child's school?
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Think of it this way. Parents are used to getting a report card at the end of the term from the teacher to find out how their student has done in school. We're now in the opposite situation. Parents need to give the teacher their own report card of how their student has been, how their child has been doing since schools closed in the middle of last March. So what we recommend you do is sit down and put together, better to do it in writing, a list of key points about how your child is doing and how your child has progressed, both developmentally and educationally, over the past 5 months. Some of the things that you might want to address in this is how your child is doing academically. We've had all this distance learning. How much work did they do? Where did they do their learning? And what didn't they do or weren't able to understand or take part in? You might want to update the school on how your child is developing in terms of social interaction. Now that they've been isolated all this time, depending on your child's disability, they may well have suffered real setbacks in their social interaction because they've been stuck at home. They may be an only child. They may have had to stay away from other people. Depending on their disability, they may not have many or any friends. And so they They may have lost ground. You need to let the school know about that. How your child is doing in terms of their adaptive needs or technology needs. Have they made any progress in using adaptive technology if they need that for their education? Or have they lost any ground in terms of that, which will need catching up? What about your child's development in terms of behavior? This COVID has been a nightmare for everyone, and for all kids, it's had mental health impacts of varying sorts. And for some kids, when in returning to school, it may well have affected some of their behavior. If they have a disability that relates to their behavior, they may have lost ground. They may have made ground. It depends on the child. The school needs to get a quick update on that. Second last, it's really important to update the school in terms of your child's health and learning needs. We're going to talk more about that a little later, but if there's been change in your child's health, or you need to let them know. Now that we're looking at the possibility of returning to school and the fact that the children are going to have to engage in social distancing and possibly wearing a mask, you need to advise the school whether your child has any experience with that, whether they understand that, whether they're receptive to that, whether they know how to wear a mask, whether they're going to be able to wear a mask, or what assistance they might need. That's a lot to tell, but it's better for the school to know that now, well before school reopens, than the teacher trying to figure that out on the first day of school on their own, or in a rushed conversation with you on the eve of school starting. Laura?
Okay, thanks for that, David. Rob, in your opinion, should parents try to communicate this information by just calling the school and phoning it in, or should they put it in writing?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I do want to stress that that type of information that David just talked about it's really important to communicate that in writing for a number of reasons. Having a paper trail can be really important depending on how those advocacy efforts develop. So it can actually be quite critical. So I do want to stress the importance of having that in writing. Of course, some of those conversations need to happen. So there may be some telephone conversations and so on. And a way around that as well is just following up from those telephone conversations. Sorry. With an email, to just summarize what was discussed and the agreed upon next steps.
Right.
So again, just to really focus that initial communication, we would strongly recommend to do so in writing.
It's just David adding one thing here. Think of it this way. A parent thinks about the needs of their own child, but the teacher needs to think about the needs of all the students coming into their class at once. And therefore, if you put this in writing in advance, it gives them a chance they don't have to be taking notes during a phone call with you. They're able to have it all at their fingertips and try to make sure they've got it at hand and can follow up on it. So the extra time you put into writing it all down in advance actually is going to make things a lot easier for them. And also, if later on there's any we're hoping everything works out well, but if some need is not met, you want to be in a position to say, hey, we let them know as soon as possible.
Right.
And here's what we let them know.
Okay, that's good advice. I think it's also important for parents to remember, like your child is your one and only, but for teachers, we have lots of kids. Class sizes are in flux right now, but for a high school student, for instance, in a non-designated school board where classes haven't been capped at 15, it's normal for a high school teacher to have 90 different students. So putting that information in writing is really, really important. Okay, so we've talked already about what parents should be telling the school, but I want to turn now to what parents should be asking the school. Before we can make informed choices, parents need a lot of information about how things will be working. The problem, of course, is that even though school is just a short time away, school boards are all still scrambling to try to figure things out. So, Rob, I want to ask you this: what kinds of questions should parents be asking of the principals of their child's school?
Sure, thanks, Laura. Perhaps I'll start just by saying that a lot of these questions will really depend on the needs of the student, and will be particular and individualized in that way. But we hope to provide some ideas and starting some starter questions and some suggestions to get going. So the first question that I think really needs to be asked is what's changed. A lot has changed around us. So what has changed in terms of how your child will be interacting with the school? So confirming that previous accommodations and supports will continue to be provided, or if they're not provided, what would be the plan in response to that, and what are the new accommodations and supports that will be available, in particular within our new COVID reality. And so the second question, I think, really also needs to be asked around what are the more specific accommodations and supports provided regarding social distancing or physical distancing and PPE. Um, I think as well the sort of ongoing questions and concerns. Questions like what level of staffing will be available to your child, including EAs and SNAs, and of course within the pandemic, that has a whole additional layer, raises a whole additional layer of concern for us to think about. And lastly, for students with disabilities who need to be oriented to the school building or the classroom, to begin asking about what the plan is around that and how to coordinate an early visit. So those type of things, I think, should be at the forefront of what we're thinking about in these early days. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. David, any thoughts about other needs that parents should discuss with their child's principal?
Well, absolutely. There's a list of needs that you should be identifying as early as possible, because the sooner they know about them, the more quickly they're able to plan to meet those needs. So one of their areas you need to focus on is what are your child's learning needs going to be when they return to school. The school knew about what your child's learning needs were before COVID hit, but have they changed? If there are any changes, we have to let them know as soon as possible. You need to let them know if your child has any needs in relation to the child's mental health and coping with transitions. If you're going to a new year, a new school, a new teacher, a new level of school from elementary school to secondary school or whatever. You need to alert the school as early as possible if your child has found, as a result of being home during COVID, that the transitions are getting harder or coping with the return to school is going to be difficult or stressful, which is fully understandable. You need to alert the school as quickly as possible. And of course, to any strategies that you've learned at home that may help that out. You need to alert the school to any skills that your child has lost over the past few months, so that they can know to plan a strategy to bring those back. You need to alert the school about whether your child has any new assessment needs. The school board has a process and resources available to do assessments of students' learning needs. Now, they might have been rolling along just fine last spring, but because of the disruption of COVID and any setbacks your child may have acquired, or any gains your child has made that may change the overall strategy for teaching your child, or where and how to teach your child, you need to let the school board know so that they can plan to launch a new assessment of your child's needs. You need to let the school know about any needs your child has in relation to dealing with COVID strategies. Are they going to be able to handle social distancing? Are they going to need help engaging in social distancing? Are they going to need staff there to facilitate? They might not have needed an education assistant before for just the issue of getting down the hall from one place to another, but in the world of where students have to socially distance, and students moving from one hall to one room to another can be a bit of a zoo, just as school is unfolding. they may need added staff support. The school board needs to know about that. And if your child is going to need assistance in wearing, you heard Rob use the term PPE, personal protective equipment, wearing a mask, or with frequent hand washing and so on, are they going to need added supports for that? Finally, this is all talking about the world of being in school, but
Right.
some of our kids are going to still be engaging in distance learning, either because you, the parent, are going to decide to keep them home, or because the school board's only going to have part of their day or part of their week in school and part at home, or because hopefully this won't happen, but a second wave leads to another round of school closures. Now, what we know from the spring is that the provincial government did not effectively plan to ensure that students with disabilities were effectively accommodated during distance learning. Some school boards did some creative things that had successes. Other students really lost ground. We need to start planning, getting schools to plan now to meet your child's needs during distance learning, whether it's because your child is staying home now all the time, part of the time, or is in school, but we have to face the realistic possibility of another round of school closures. So it's important to let the school board know as quickly as possible now what your child's needs are in relation to distance learning, what barriers they face, and if you can, any strategies you think that would help. Laura?
Okay. Rob, I want to throw it to you for a second. Do you think it's appropriate when parents are sharing all of this information with teachers and administrators? Do you think it's appropriate to make concrete recommendations and suggestions like do this with my child, but don't do that?
The short answer is yes. When possible and when appropriate, I think concrete suggestions can really help, and sometimes with supporting documentation, if necessary and appropriate as well, can really help. But especially given the tight timelines that we're in right now, being clear and concrete, I think, is really important to begin that conversation and begin the process.
Put it this way, the more you have a solution, you're saving the school board from trying to find a solution. Now they'll give your suggestions some thought, and they may follow it. They may come up with something better, or raise it with you. And it's important to encourage the school to talk to you if they want to try something different, and be collaborative. But in any event, the more you can help them in the middle of a pandemic solve the problem,
Yeah.
the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, I would echo that too as a teacher. I mean, especially knowing, for instance, what your child's triggers are. So like I have a child who's very sensitive to noise. We had to tell them, look, if there's going to be a planned fire drill, you need to take her out of the building before it hits. And those kinds of tips I think are important. David, I know one thing that caused a lot of frustration for parents in the spring is that teachers were using a lot of different learning platforms like Brightspace or Google Classroom for their classes, some of which had huge accessibility barriers. What should parents be doing to ensure that their child has an accessible school platform?
Well, the same barriers in a virtual meeting platform that hurt students with certain disabilities will also hurt parents with certain disabilities if they're trying to take part, and teachers and other educational staff with disabilities. Unfortunately, amidst the flurry to move to online learning, the provincial government did not do its job by showing leadership, helping the 72 school boards figure out which platforms are appropriate to use and which have accessibility problems. And so they left each school board to flounder. And we fear a number of them didn't even know that they were floundering with accessibility issues. And as a blind individual, I can tell you right now, some platforms are easy to use with a screen reader that reads to us what's on the screen. The same for people with dyslexia. Others are harder to use, and others we can't really use very much at all. But also, these platforms change. It may be that a platform was bad and got better, or was good and got worse. So what you need to do is to first, as a parent, look into this and let the school know if there's some concern you've got about whether they're using an appropriate platform. I can tell you that as of now, the day we're speaking, August 21st, 2020, Zoom is by far the most accessible platform, but we've heard that there's at least one school board that's forbidden people from using it. And I know that some school boards are using other platforms for parent-teacher meetings or other type meetings that are actually very inaccessible. And so it's important. What we want the province to do is to lay down the law here so we don't need 72 boards reinventing the wheel on this. But in the meantime, as parents, you need to know figure out which platforms your child can use or you could use to help your child, and then let your principal and teacher know, because it may not be coming down from the top, but maybe we can do a bottoms up strategy to fix this. And by the way, the platforms that are easiest for us people that, with disabilities to use tend to be the platforms that are easiest for people without disabilities to use as well. I'm not on commission for Zoom, by the way, and if other platforms can meet or beat its accessibility, my view is go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, new topic. Most students with disabilities have what is called an individual education plan or an IEP. Rob, can you just discuss briefly what is an IEP and where can parents go to learn the basics of a good IEP?
Sure, thanks, Laura, and I'll try to keep this short. An individual education plan is a document prepared by the school in consultation with parents, identifying the supports and accommodations required by the student. In human rights law, it's considered to be an accommodation plan, or like an accommodation plan. I do wish to note one thing before we go any further, that a student does not need to be identified by the Identification, Placement and Review Committee, or IPRC, in order to have an IEP.
I'm just
So
going to
there,
jump in, Rob, and just add that
yeah,
it turns out that half of the students in Ontario who have an individual education plan have never been had their disability formally identified by an individual or Identification and Placement Review Committee. It is absolutely not necessary. If your child has a disability and you think they need an accommodation plan, you just ask for it. You can just ask for it, whether or not you've ever had any formal process like that.
mm-hmm. Right. Thanks, David. And maybe I'll leave it there. I think in terms of information, there is quite a lot out there. Laura, you mentioned the OAC resource guide, and you have some good links there and materials, and Arch's website as well has some materials on IEP. So perhaps I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I think it's worth noting that as students go further along in the education system into the higher grades, the IEPs seem to get shorter. The ones that I've seen for my children when they were in elementary school were pages and pages long. Sometimes the documentation that we get as teachers for high school students is, you know, a page or so. And sometimes the IEPs don't even specify what the exact disability is that the student has. It might just say learning disability or communication disorder, and it doesn't tell us specifically. So that sort of leaves it to parents to decide, you know, do they want to disclose the specific disability that their child has? And I would say if you trust the teacher, it's a good idea to do that, because it can help us be sort of more specific in modifying our curriculum and doing interventions that will help the child in the classroom. Now, David, I want to ask you this. Since we're not sure when students with disabilities will get an IEP this fall, we don't know if timelines will be the same. What should parents be doing in the interim? Should they just wait until the school approaches them, or what?
Very important question for parents. The formal individual education plan process is a process that unfortunately needs to be improved and can take days or weeks or more. And in fact, the individual education plan may not get hammered out till the middle of the term. And students can't wait, and teachers can't wait, and parents can't wait. So there are really two things I want to suggest on two tracks. The first is, don't wait for the school to come to you and say, well, do you think your student needs an IEP, or would you like to have, you know, give input into an improved IEP if they've already got one, and so on. I would recommend that you take the steps that we've talked about earlier. Let the school know as soon as possible how your child has been doing, where their deficits have been, what their learning needs and what accommodations needs you think they have, and ask them to talk to you about it now. Let's get those actual measures in place to help them learn now. Let's not wait for a formal document to be formalized. And I hope and trust that teachers and principals would feel the same way. Like, let's get teaching these kids and do it the right way. And we'll do the paperwork as we go. And I don't think of IEP as just paperwork, but it's important to get all that started. The second track is this: whether you're talking about this in terms of a formal written individual education plan, or just, hey, what can you do for my child on day one when he or she returns to school? One thing that every parent can do, and I think every parent should do, who feels it would help, is ask the school for a meeting to discuss your child's needs and the plans they have for accommodating them. If I was going to give it a formal fancy name, I'd call it an IEP meeting, but don't worry whether you give it a formal name. Have the meeting. Now with distance learning, we can do it through Zoom. Insist that they, or other virtual meeting platform. You can do it whatever time works for you. In fact, it's going to be easier if you do it virtually. You don't have to go running over to the school. It's going to save you time. And whether we were in COVID days where we're dealing with this, or even if we were past COVID days, every parent is entitled to and would benefit from asking for a chance to meet with the teacher, the principal, and other appropriate supports to talk about their child's disability-related learning needs and what should be done for them. And I strongly encourage you to consider asking.
Okay, that's a great suggestion, David. Thank you. Rob, let me ask you this. What could a parent do if they feel that the IEP is not adequate, or if they have concerns that the school hasn't been living up to the IEP or the teacher hasn't been following it?
Thanks, Laura. And I do want to pick up on David's point and really stress that a lot of what we've been talking about and suggesting sort of takes us beyond the formal process and the formal IEP process and the document itself. And we're talking a lot about things that need to be placed in the interim, things that need to happen very, very soon in order for school to get started in a meaningful way for our students. So we need to really keep that in mind as we think about that. I mean, I think we're all, all of our lives have been upended, but the one constant here is that human rights continues to be enforced here in this province, and COVID-19 has not suspended human rights in this province. So we need to continue pushing and ensuring that kids get what they need to access school. So with that as a starting point, I just want to talk a little bit about your question in terms of, if an IEP is inadequate or not properly implemented, as the semester goes on. And I would add to that, if interim plans and measures are not adequate or provide safe and meaningful education to your child in returning to school or on online learning, the same applies. There are steps that can be taken. And again, just to our earlier point, receiving legal advice, seeking legal advice in those early steps in terms of formulating, what the issues are and what the steps might be, is really critical and important. One thing I do want to, kind of highlight for people is that the Education Act doesn't directly provide a process for parents to challenge the lack of supports and accommodations. So that's a really, really important point to keep in mind. If advocacy efforts are not successful, so we talked a little bit about, the sort of the chain of command and some strategies around advocacy, but if all of that doesn't work, isn't as effective as one would hope, there may be other options and other legal options in asserting your child's rights under Ontario's Human Rights Code, and that would be within the human rights process. So again, I think getting legal advice at that stage would be quite important and quite critical.
And I just want, Laura, let me just add one more thing. This isn't just a matter, ordinarily, if your child's in school in the spring and school's operating normally, you have an individual, if they have an individual education plan, and in the fall, they sort of sit down, look at the plan, and say, well, what do we need to change? They all, I shouldn't say they all, they likely will all need to change in light of COVID. It is fair to ask for things to be included to accommodate and address your child's needs in relation to safely being included fully in school. And it's fair to ask for things that will assist your child in being able to fully participate in distance learning. That can all be included there, but that again is what you can talk about using the measures we've already suggested, long before you get to a table meeting and talking about what's going in the actual document, just talking about what you're asking the school to provide your child starting on day one. Laura?
I just want to add in one reflection here as a teacher. It wasn't really something that I thought about until I switched to the other side of the desk as a special needs mom. But in all of my years as a teacher, I have never had an administrator come and check on me to see that I'm implementing an IEP. It's just never happened. So what that means is that the burden of advocacy really falls to the parent and if possible to the student. So if the IEP, for instance, says the child has an accommodation for extra time on tests and exams, if a teacher doesn't provide that, then it's up to the parents to point that out and contact the school and advocate for that. And that can be tricky because sometimes our kids don't tell us, you know, they don't want to be singled out. So it's an ongoing challenge, but it really means sort of being on top of things and communicating regularly with the teacher and with your kid.
Laura, just one thing I want to jump in and add, if I may, quickly. We're talking today about what parents can do over the next couple of weeks as we move to school reopening. But I do want you to know that the kind of shortcomings in the current system for individual education plans is very much a topic that our organizations have been concerned about, and we are advocating to get reformed. So for example, if you want to learn more, if you go to aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org, on our homepage, you can sign up to get our email updates. You'll see what we're advocating for in this context at the provincial level. I don't want to take up time on the details of that now, but I want you to know there are folks of us who are on it, including the three on this doing this discussion. But today we're focusing on what you should be thinking about doing now and over the next couple of weeks. Laura?
Mm-hmm. So I wasn't really planning on doing this, but we do have a couple of really good questions coming in on the YouTube channel that I just want to address. We're talking about, you know, asking for an IEP meeting, and whether someone's asking if it's realistic that that meeting could happen before school starts. I would give that a definite maybe. It depends on the individual school. And then someone else is asking, can you address the needs of kids who don't have strong parent advocates? And I guess one of the things that I would point out is that, you know, if you as a parent are not necessarily comfortable going into a school meeting or addressing these things yourself, you can always take a friend or somebody with you who can help advocate for you. We also have somebody who's watching us from City TV and is asking about concerns from parents going back to school. We're going to sort of address that in a broad sense. I know one of the issues is transportation. Many students with disabilities need to rely on the school to provide transportation for their children. We're going to pause here to acknowledge that parents will have a long list of questions on this topic. And I think one of the problems here is that schools don't yet have the answers. So we were talking about this last night, and I think it would be helpful from an advocacy perspective to consider the questions discussed earlier around support needs, but to put that in a transportation context, and for parents, again, to provide that information to their child's school as soon as possible. There's also been a lot of media attention this summer, and this is a big concern, on the issue of students with disabilities having their school day shortened or being excluded from school altogether. Now, ARCH and the AODA Alliance and the OAC have already done a lot of work on this issue already. I'd encourage people to watch the Facebook Live that David and I did on exclusions back in July for some context. And again, the links to all of these things will be in the show notes. Also, Arch has produced an excellent document called Advocacy Toolkit, Your Right Not to be Excluded from School in Ontario. So although we've covered a lot of this already, let's do a quick review for our viewers. David, can you talk quickly about what is an exclusion and what is a modified school day?
Okay, start from the point of view that the starting point that the Education Act says each child has the right to go to school, get an education. Despite that, there's a section in the Education Act that says that every principal can refuse to admit a person to school, and that has been treated by school boards as including students, refuse to admit them to school if they think that their presence would be detrimental to the well-being of the students there. And so, and it's a very broad power. It's not, and we have been concerned for a long time that it is disproportionately used to exclude some students with disabilities from school. They're essentially told, go home. And sometimes it's maybe done in a formal process of a principal formally telling the parent, I'm excluding your child from school under section 265 1M of the Education Act, or it might simply be a phone call saying, you know, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith or Ms. Smith, we'd like you to pick up your child because we're having an issue, with nothing more than a phone call. The other power is for the school board to reduce to some extent the length of the school day for students with some disabilities. So that's not saying you can't come at all, it's saying you can only come for a certain number of hours in the day. But from the point of view of the parent and the student, it's two sides of the same coin. You've got the right to go to school, but now you're being told you can't come at all, or you can only come for part of the time and you're excluded for the rest of the time.
Thanks for that, David. Rob, can an exclusion be done because the school feels it can't accommodate a child's disability?
Our position has always been that exclusions, and I'd add to that, that shortening the school day as well, you know, should never be the answer to a failure to accommodate a child with disabilities.
Okay.
So let's just give the practical situation. The concern's been raised, and Rob's talked about this publicly on behalf of Arch. If a principal, this is pre-COVID, if a principal were to say to a parent, sorry, your child has, we always have an education assistant with your child, the EA called in sick, so we can't provide an EA today, so please pick your child up and keep them at home or don't bring them in. That would be failing to meet their duty to accommodate, i.e. the obligation of the school board to find another EA or another staff person to assist. And then compounding it by then telling them to stay home because they were the board failed to accommodate. Mm-hmm. And those kind of situations which Arch has reported are some of the circumstances where we are very concerned.
Yeah, and of course they're really problematic for parents who, of course, have to deal with their employers and may not be able to drop everything and just go pick up their kids on such short notice. David, why are you concerned that we may see a spike in exclusions of students with disabilities this fall in particular?
Well, if you go to our COVID page, aodaalliance.org/COVID, you'll see that we released a report this summer, the AODA Alliance did. We surveyed all the school boards to say, do you have a policy on when and how a principal can use this power? Because they get very little guidance from the province. There's very little policy direction from the province on how to use this. And what we found out was that a majority of school boards don't have any policy at all. Of the 72 boards, only 33 boards have any policy, and those policies vary wildly. We analyze them. Some have good ingredients, some have troubling ingredients, but it's a total patchwork, and the rights of parents and kids around this province vary arbitrarily depending where you live, not depending on your shared right to due process and entitlement to fairness. And we're worried because if principals who we don't blame principals. Let me be clear. They're struggling in a world where they're not getting the proper direction and guidance from the province they need, but where they don't have that proper direction and guidance, either from the province or from their school board. If before COVID, there was a worry that some were using this in a way that disproportionately hurt students with disabilities. We're worried that with COVID, with the reopening of schools, with all the uncertainty, with the concern that there aren't enough staff being provided by the province and to help school reopening happen by virtue of a lack of a proper provincial plan to meet the needs of students with disabilities during reopening, some principals may resort to this again and say, look, I think that's the safest thing or the best thing, or what I'm going to just say is stay home. We're concerned as well that because boards aren't required to collect data on this, the province doesn't require them to report and make public how often this happens. Some boards have a policy to do so, others don't. That this could become a serious problem this fall, and that's why we flagged it. Now, sadly, even though we've been calling on the province to give directions to principals to narrow and rein in this sweeping and arbitrary power of principals, the province hasn't done so, and we think that that's unfair to parents, to students, and to principals. Laura?
Okay. David, I think you sort of already addressed this. Does the ministry itself have any specific policies on when a student can be excluded from school or to have their school day shortened?
Well, let me just explain this. The ministry puts out policy memos to school boards. They have a fancy name. They're called policy and program memos, or PPMs. Mm-hmm. And they are treated seriously by school boards. They're not laws, but they're policy directions. And we've searched and we've asked this ministry for any they have on this topic. And all we found was a couple of paragraphs in one PPM, and that's it. So basically, they're leaving principals to be a law unto themselves, and they're leaving each school board to do as much or as little to oversee this. And for parents, this can be very frustrating. I can tell you that our coalition, I had a team of wonderful volunteer law students writing all the school boards to try to find out what their policies are. And half of the boards, 36 of them, didn't even answer us. And so it can be very hard for a parent if they are fearing this could happen to their child, or it has happened to their child, fearing that if they want to know what their school board's policy is on it, they may have as much trouble as we did finding out what it is, what their policy is, if they have one at all.
Now, has the government gotten advice about what it should be doing for students during the school reopening?
Okay, this is really important to focus on so people understand this. While everybody's struggling with the immediate pressures for their own child, which is job number one for all parents, we've also been doing advocacy at the provincial level, and any number of community organizations, including those those of us here, were advising the government months ago to create a plan for school reopening that specifically focuses on the needs of students with disabilities to ensure that they're fully and safely included. The government has not announced the comprehensive plan we need, but aside from the advice that the government got from various community organizations like ours, the government also got advice from a government-appointed advisory body. I mentioned earlier that I'm a member of the Kindergarten to Grade 12 Education Standards Development Committee. That's a long name for a bunch of folks from the disability community and the education sector, school boards and teachers and so on. We have been working for a couple of years now to come up with recommendations for new regulations to tear down the barriers facing students with disabilities generally. That work is still in progress. But when COVID hit, we formed a subcommittee that worked very hard over this summer to make a report to the government on what it needs to do to address the needs of students with disabilities during COVID and particularly during school reopening. Mm-hmm. We rendered that report back on the 24th of July, just about a month ago. It's up on the AODA Alliance website. If you go to aodaalliance.org/education, you can see it there. It's a public document. It's got great recommendations. It borrows from those that we put forward and adds and improves them. But still, here again, the government has not announced a policy, or pardon me, a plan, a comprehensive plan to assist school boards in what to do. So again, each school board is left to reinvent the wheel, struggle in the middle of a pandemic to figure out what to do with these students, to meet the needs of students with disabilities at the same time as it's struggling to figure out what to do just to get schools open.
Wow. So the government's received tons of advice from your committee, from stakeholder groups and organizations, and there's still no comprehensive plan in place. Okay. Robert, before I get into wrapping things up, did you have any other thoughts or any random points that you wanted to get in?
Thanks, Laura, and I'm just cognizant of the time, so I'll just
Right.
keep it brief. But certainly, Arch is also concerned and shares the concerns that were just provided by David. And we've also been undertaking some advocacy efforts. And again, in terms of some of the resources, I certainly welcome everyone to review our website at archdisabilitylaw.ca. Thanks, Laura.
All
Laura,
right.
it's David. Just one last thing I want to mention. I want to build on a theme we've mentioned. Folks at school boards have been working day and night round the clock trying to figure out what to do.
Mhm.
And they are, I think, as worried as we are.
Yeah.
And so I think the best thing parents can do, drawing on the practical tips we've suggested, is put together information for the school boards on how your child's doing and what they need, what the school board teachers, the school should be doing.
Mhm.
Put it forward in a constructive and positive way, recognizing that you're making your suggestions to people who are as worried as you are and quite overloaded. If you don't get what you want and you feel you need, as Rob said, work your way up the hierarchy. You don't write the director of education first.
Yeah.
You want to go first to the teacher, then the principal, and then each step up. And much as you may be angry, upset, frustrated, worried, and have a lot of emotion, we all do. It's still worthwhile writing with a tone or speaking with a tone that acknowledges that they are dealing with the unknown, the uncertain, and to the extent that you can broker a solution that's really effective. If on the other hand, and Rob's folks at Arch are fantastic for giving you advice. If you have to resort to other things that Rob talked about, that we hope that won't be the case, but in any event, trying that strategy first always helps, and we hope that's going to solve many of the problems that could arise. Laura?
Right. Thanks for that, David. That's really good. Good to hear. So, look, guys, there's so much more that we could talk about, but we're going to have to stop it there. I want to thank David and Rob so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. I hope for our viewers that you found this information helpful. If you did, please share this video once it's posted on the OAC YouTube channel. To get email updates from the AODA Alliance, and I really recommend you do that, they're quite helpful, go to their website homepage where there's a link that you can sign up and get those email alerts. You can also find both the AODA Alliance and the Ontario Autism Coalition on Facebook and Twitter. And as Rob mentioned, you can learn more about Arch Disability Law by visiting their website. I want to end today with the words of a longtime Jewish disability inclusion expert, Lisa Friedman. She reminds us that, quote, inclusion is not a program. Inclusion is a mindset. It is the way we treat others and the way they treat us. Inclusion is the opportunity to learn together and from one another. Thanks so much to everybody for taking the time to watch today. Stay safe, everyone. And we wish you all the very best this school year. Good luck.